one of the topics you have been adamant that we discussed was the Harvard legacy findings. So Harvard Institute did a research project on its connection to slavery, and the findings were interesting. I was not the least bit shocked, surprised, or appalled. Jay, you want to speak a little bit to the Harvard report before we jump into the material?
Yeah. Harvard's is thought of as one of the leading institutions in the world. And the school is older than the country that it is in. Okay. And it has it has one of the largest, if not the largest endowment in the US. And you don't get that much money. Their endowment is more than $30 billion at this point for a school that has, just around 10,000 people, graduate and undergraduate. You don't get that. It might be definitely no more than like 14,000. You don't get that level of generational wealth that just compounds over almost 400 years. You don't get that level without having your hand in all of the things that make money. And slavery and all of the ancillary industries of slavery made a fuck ton of money throughout the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. And
still does.
And still does even today.
Prison slave labor, but that's not the topic at hand. We can do
trafficking
a discussion connecting the findings to the current prison attendee list.
Yeah. The whole industrial complex within
the whole industrial complex and its ties. I mean, again, you and I can have that conversation asleep, but it's important, I think, as a history major, to always put these topics into context so that people can understand the timeline, people can understand the connection, and you can also understand the multi-layered intricacies of what we know as America and its founding on, and its founding economy based on slavery. So jumping right into it, just to give the broad strokes, because the findings were, pretty deep and significant. There has been numerous discussions on it and debates discussing the findings. So I'll just give you some of the main broad strokes, and then we can discuss relevance and importance of it from a non-political standpoint, because this is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is just American history. And this is what happened. And that's what we're here to discuss. So I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind when we have the discussion, Jay, is that Harvard is not alone in this. It's not like every other institution at the time was the beacon of freedom and had some kind of monopoly on a moral high compass. They didn't. These findings are similar across Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Williams. All of those universities benefited and evolved, not just benefited, but continued its growth and evolution to the institutions that they are today due to their ties to slavery. Mm-hmm. One of the things that needs to be kept in mind when we have this discussion is that Harvard was not a bystander to slavery. It was not slavery adjacent. It wasn't like, oh, look over there. I can't believe those people are doing that. They actively participated and maintained slavery. And what is even probably more important to understand is that the founding of that school and its theologies still bleed into the studies of students there today. But we can get into that. Mm-hmm. So it's important to understand, like I said, it's not just Harvard alone, but we're going to use Harvard because they're the ones who released their report on it, which really came out on the heels of Brown University doing a similar study and releasing its findings, I think, in the late either 1990s or early 2000s. So Harvard basically did a comparison of itself to Brown's University's findings, which is the catalyst for the Harvard study. One of the things that's important to note is that slavery did not just occur in the South, it was thriving in the North. And I think that's one of the highlights of the study, is to show how relevant the North was in keeping slavery going. It wasn't like if you escaped from the South and went to the North, you were now free. This was not Kansas, and you were not walking down the yellow brick road in The Wizard of Oz. You were fucked in the North, just in a different way. So pretty much Harvard was founded, I believe, in 1636, which is within 2 decades of 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the United States. So Harvard had its dick stuck in slavery from its own founding. And from the start, there is written documentation that confirms there was at least one male slave living on the campus, only referred to in literary work as the Moor. And I mean,
The
don't even get me
mole.
started. The
Oh
mole.
my God.
And the importance of this relates to the slave trade in two ways. At the time, this was at the tail's end of the Pequot War, where the Puritans fought the Indians in southern Connecticut and basically like stole their land.
Mhm.
And the Pequot slave trade also helped continue the slave trade outside of the colonies, but into the West Indies, where cotton, tobacco, sugar was advantageous to develop for plantation owners here in America. So a lot of slavery that occurred in the Caribbean, that wealth was transferred back to the colonies, where masters and plantation owners were able to build their land ownership and their wealth here.
Mhm.
So when this slave trade occurred in the West Indies, one of the ships returned from the West Indies with enslaved Africans. And we believe that that's the starting point of the documented note of the Moor being on campus. Also, this wasn't a one-off. We know, based on Harvard's own findings, that at least 5 Harvard presidents had continued economic ties to the South and to the West Indies, particularly during the 18th century when the slave trade was at its peak.
Mhm.
So the presidents of Harvard, at least half a dozen of them, were all family members of merchant traders. And the merchant traders were the ones responsible for making sure that the slave trade continued and thrived between the colonies and the West Indies.
Mhm.
So
And they're getting paid for all that.
oh yeah, everybody's making
Yeah,
money.
be like, oh, hey, I was just running the boat. No,
Yeah,
you're getting
no.
paid. You know
This
you're
is
getting paid to
complicit.
load this boat up with slaves and bring it somewhere
Absolutely.
else.
Absolutely. This is not a one-off. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a random, okay, let's just do this one deal. There was a continued effort under half a dozen Harvard presidents who all hailed from trading families to uphold slavery even after it ended. So even after slavery ends in the North, one of the businesses that continues supplying the South with laborers are universities. So before the peak of the slave trade, there were only 3 college universities that were doing well. There were almost 70 that had opened up, but had collapsed. Colleges and universities tripled between 1746 and 1769 from 3 to 9 colleges. It's not an accident that universities triple at the same time there's the height of the slave trade, meaning when the slave trade was at its economic peak, the universities multiplied. Meaning that there is a direct correlation between an uptick in the economic mobility that plantation owners were going through. And a lot of those owners started donating land to universities.
Mhm.
So Harvard is one of those benefactors of land ownership from a royal family who had investments here, bought land from slavery money, and then donated that land to universities, one of them being Harvard.
Now, which royal family? The British royal family, or a family that was linked?
They're called the Royals. The one specific person is named Isaac Royals, who made money off sugar plantations. He owned 700 acres of land in the 18th century. So because of this relationship between white males who attended universities, white male land ownership, white males owning slaves, they were able to reap the benefits of this in a bunch of different ways. So they benefit off of sheer labor. There is at least 70 documented Black people that were owned by either Harvard leadership, presidents, staff, and faculty from the founding of the university all the way up to 1783, when slavery was made unlawful, specifically in Massachusetts. But that doesn't stop the slave trade there, nor does that stop Harvard's involvement in it. Because they benefited so much from the slave labor, they continue to trade slaves back and forth from the West Indies to the plantations in Massachusetts. So seeing slaves on the campus was part of the daily life for students at that time. So the New England economy is literally in bed and completely tied to the South and the Caribbean, because those investments in the plantation sector in the Caribbean is money that's used in the colonies. So Isaac Royal is one of those people who benefited from the slave trade. He donates some of the 700 acres of land that his family owns to Harvard, which Harvard sells to endow their first professorship at the school.
Mm-hmm.
That land is also the same land that Harvard Law School is built on.
Uh-huh.
And then the law school, the business schools, and the medical schools, the theologies are all based on the economic experience of the people of those times. So not only did they participate in the slave trade from an economic standpoint, from a theological standpoint, they also created the rhetoric that made slavery morally, ethically, and legally okay.
Right, because these are
and
all
then that was preached in their law schools.
Right, exactly.
And in their business schools.
These are all, and it's not just like this is just some back alley where they're teaching these things. This is
right.
Harvard has always
been
Harvard. It is the premier university, and it has been
absolutely
for centuries. And so the thought leadership that's coming from there is also meant to undergird, to support the structure that helped them make all their fucking money in the first place. And so it's this virtuous cycle where we got land from people who own slaves, and then we're going to endow professorships with that land, and with that, we're going to sell some of that land to endow a professorship. We're going to bring these professors in, and they're going to teach that all of this shit is okay. And now all the next generation of leaders that just got their fancy Harvard degrees are going to go out and spread that message as well. And then
not only are they going to go out and spread that message,
money back.
And not only are they going to go out and spread that message, they're going to go out and become plantation owners themselves, right? Because now they're educated, they're successful, they're wealthy. And now they have the scientific and legal authority, or so they think, to treat their slaves the way they treat them, because now they have these theologians basically telling them across a bunch of different professions that slavery is okay.
Right.
Here's why it's okay legally.
Was very much a part of everything at that point. And yes. Harvard has a leading seminary school as well, which is where Dr. Martin Luther King got his PhD from.
Absolutely. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it's the divinity school professorship that is the first professorship born from land sold that was donated to them by a plantation owner.
That's some shit.
And then speaking to how it bleeds into the actual subject matter and curriculum, one of the things that, as you just discussed, was highlighted and imported into the curriculum are eugenics and racial bias through science.
Of course.
So there is a professor named Louis Agassiz, who was from Switzerland, who does a comparative anatomy studies. Basically, he's one of the forefathers of eugenics. He believed major progenitors of races being separate species. He purported that God created 5 different Adam and Eves. So each race has its own version of Adam and Eve. And he believed in a racial hierarchy where whites were on top and blacks were on the bottom.
Of course he did.
Another example of this is the fact that one of the things that highlighted wealth of universities was actually how many bodies or corpses they owned at the time. So, for example, one of the slaves that was bought, right.
It's a flex.
It was exactly how you flex. Like, look how many dead black bodies I have. Well, look how many dead black bodies I have. Well, look how many we have sewn together. I'm not even making this up. I mean, these are the findings from Harvard. One such example is that of a young black boy named Sturman. He was a 17-year-old exhibit creature, for lack of better terms. He was kidnapped from Africa and brought to New England as an exhibition. And he and several other Black people were forced to dress up as caricatures of Africans. So they had to run around in like a leopard print and spears, like imagine, Tarzan, but in the 18th century. Mm-hmm. And after, years of this abuse, he hung himself. And to double down on the disregard for the Black body, his body was donated to Harvard, where it was dissected. And his remains are in the Harvard Peabody Museum collection, I believe, to this day, in the care of Professor Agassiz, one of the proponents of eugenics. And using his body, he measured Sturman and said that the measurements on Sturman proved that he was somewhere between whites and apes. And his body was basically, even in his death, used to prove his own inferiority and justification for slavery. And that inequality was embedded in the Harvard curriculum. So in the 1850s, when Harvard Medical School tries to desegregate, of course, there is massive pushback because the white male student body did not think that they should be subjected to going to school with non-equals being the Black people that they are experimenting on and studying for the purposes of medical and economical growth. So so the students basically protest Black people going to the school.
Mm-hmm.
I believe at the time it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, who is the professor of anatomy and dean of medical school at the time, who caves to the pressure of the students. So the 3 Black men that were admitted, one of which was Martin Delany, a very famous Black abolitionist, and also 2 other local students, were then expelled from the university after being admitted because of the backlash from the white students. And to this day, because of that backlash, Harvard still has one of the lowest rates of letting in Black people.
And nowadays, if you get into Harvard for anything, med school or whatever, they're just going to say you got in for affirmative action anyway.
Right. So one of the legacies
while white people had affirmative action at Harvard for literally centuries.
Right. I mean, and still do through legacy, through sports.
That's the real affirmative action.
That's the real affirmative action, is through legacy. But I guess we're not ready to talk about that. And it's also important to keep in mind, though, that while all this was going on, there was always an abolitionist movement. It's not like Black people tolerated this. And then 20 years later, Martin Luther King was born and was like, we hate this. Since the first Black slave was brought to this country, the first freedom fighter was formed. And one of those freedom fighters was W.E. Du Bois. The French would say Dubois, who is one of the Harvard graduates and very profound African-American philosopher, author, and the co-founder of the Niagara Movement, which is the precursor to the NAACP. Mm-hmm. And his work, along with Charles Hamilton Houston and Beatrice Dykes, leads to the fall of Jim Crow, because I believe, if I remember correctly, Charles Houston does a precursor law case before Brown versus Board, which is the desegregation of schools. They also had white allies as well. There was a German professor at Harvard named Charles Fallon, who was considered a rebel. He was chased out of Germany for being too radical, comes to Harvard, becomes a professor, and aligns himself with the abolitionists. But due to all the plantation owning families who donated to the school and had children attending the school, he was forced out. To this day, 2 of the largest donors to the school is the Livingston family, which is the largest slave trading family in New York, rivaled only by slave trading families who come from Rhode Island and New Jersey. And the second largest slave trading family was the DeWolf family. So these are the families that no one ever hears of in America. Their name is not in mainstream public, and yet they're as old as the Rockefellers. Right. And
they didn't go into politics.
They didn't go into politics because they didn't have to. They already had the money, the wealth, and the access to the resources. Mm-hmm. They already influenced the ideologies and theologies that people who have attended these universities have studied for 7 generations. So there's no need to go into politics when you hold the pen to the books that the politicians are studying, right? If you're writing the laws, there's no need for you to also come down from the mountaintop and follow them. So similarly, Princeton has a very similar background. They started off a very rocky school. They did not have immediate funding until they also get involved into the slave trade. And it's through Princeton that the Scottish network is built. Now, we got to remember there was a Scottish Enlightenment period. A lot of our theology and our philosophy was based on the findings and the works of Scottish writers. It's important to note that the Ku Klux Klan was started by Scottish Americans after the war. So there was a rich history between religious radicals of Scottish descent and racism in this country. There was the Scottish diaspora that spread out throughout the colonies, up to and including the backwoods of the Carolinas. And similarly to Harvard, looked for resources and money in the South. They also were a proponent of race science. They also used dead Black bodies for research. A lot of our medical findings to this day comes from the experimentation that went on with Black bodies, alive and dead. This perpetuates the ideas that come to defend slavery. It gives it an intellectual legitimacy, and it gives it a scientific credential because these are the scientific findings from one of the most elite universities at the time. And this funding also gives rise to more schools, law schools, business schools, because these were institutions that were using the funding from slavery to basically build the theology to keep slavery going. And this is in the North.
Emphasize that one more time.
This is all
in the North.
This is all in the North, by the way. So what we know regarding dissections of the body, medical surgeries, what we know about anesthesia, what we know about pain, thresholds of pain, all come from the experimentation of Blacks, which was replicated by the Nazis during the Holocaust because they experimented on Jews. And they actually continued those experiments, the Nazis, when they fled, many of whom who were never prosecuted, but were allowed legally to leave the country and continue their medical research in colonies like Chile and Argentina, colonies that exist to this day.
Mm-hmm.